She was beautiful, talented, and groundbreaking, the first black woman to be nominated for a Best Actress Oscar. They called her the Black Marilyn Monroe, but behind Dorothy Dandridge's dazzling smile was a life full of heartbreak, betrayal, and loss. Once Hollywood's rising star, she died nearly penniless, with only $2 to her name. So what really happened? How did a woman with the world at her feet end up forgotten and alone? And what's become of the luxurious Hollywood Hills home she once called her sanctuary? Today, we're going inside Dorothy Dandridge's abandoned house, uncovering her net worth at the time of death and the haunting truth behind her sad, tragic ending. Stay tuned. You won't believe what we found. It's easy to say Dorothy Dandridge was destined for stardom. Her mother, Ruby Dandridge, was already a working actress and performer, and showbiz ran in the family. But Dorothy's journey was never easy. From the very start, the odds were stacked against her, and that meant she had to fight for everything she achieved. When Dorothy was born, her mother had just left her husband 5 months earlier and was now raising 2 daughters alone. Ruby was trying to make ends meet and build her own career in entertainment, all while navigating life as a single mother. Desperate for support, she turned to her close friend Geneva Williams, who helped raise the girls and train them for the stage. Together they created The Wonder Children, a singing and dancing act featuring young Dorothy and her sister Vivian. But there was more happening behind the scenes. Ruby and Geneva were romantically involved, a secret they kept hidden. And while Geneva might have been a partner to Ruby, she was far from maternal. Left in charge of Dorothy and Vivian while Ruby pursued her career, Geneva's strict discipline often crossed the line. She had a violent temper, and the girls were frequently subjected to harsh treatment. Meanwhile, school took a back seat as they toured constantly, performing instead of attending class. Dorothy's childhood was anything but normal, and by the time she was a teenager, her life had already taken a dramatic turn. She began landing bit parts in films, and the Dandridge sisters were performing at some of the country's most iconic venues, including the Apollo Theater and Harlem's famed Cotton Club. It was there that Dorothy met teenage dance prodigy Harold Nicholas of the Nicholas Brothers, and at just 16 years old, she fell hard. This wasn't just a teenage crush. For Dorothy, it felt like the beginning of something real. Dorothy Dandridge was madly in love with Harold Nicholas, but she faced a difficult crossroads. Her career was taking off, and a major opportunity was calling, one she couldn't ignore. With a heavy heart, she parted ways with Harold and joined her sister for a lengthy European tour as part of the Dandridge sisters. But the timing couldn't have been worse. While performing in London, the Blitz began. Night after night, the sisters huddled in bomb shelters with hundreds of strangers, surrounded by the deafening sounds of explosions and chaos. It was a terrifying experience that forced them to cut the tour short and rush back to the U.S., bringing Dorothy back into Harold's orbit once again. Reunited and full of momentum, Dorothy felt unstoppable. She wanted more than just success. She wanted freedom. Eager to strike out on her own, she slowly stepped away from her sister and focused on launching a solo career in film. And in the early 1940s, one of the few ways a woman could escape her family's grip was through marriage. So, in 1942, Dorothy married Harold Nicholas. It seemed like a fairy tale on the surface. 2 talented young stars in love. But behind closed doors, it was far from perfect. Hollywood offered few meaningful roles for black actresses, so Dorothy turned to the parallel race film industry, movies made by and for black audiences. She landed a role in Four Shall Die, but the film flopped, and it wasn't the big break she'd hoped for. At the same time, her marriage was already unraveling. Harold, once her sweetheart, grew distant and dismissive. Worse, he was unfaithful, not just emotionally, but physically. Dorothy had fought for love and independence, but instead, she found herself trapped in a marriage that quickly turned cold and painful. If Harold Nicholas hadn't been her first love, maybe Dorothy Dandridge would have had the strength to walk away. But instead of blaming him for his coldness and infidelity, she turned inward, believing that she was the problem, that maybe she wasn't good enough, even in the bedroom. They managed to get through that difficult first year, and for a moment it seemed like things might improve. Then came the twist that changed everything. In early 1943, Dorothy learned she was pregnant. She held on to hope that the baby would bring them closer, that parenthood might heal what love alone couldn't. But Harold proved once again how unreliable he really was. When Dorothy went into labor at her sister-in-law's home, she waited anxiously for Harold to come and take her to the hospital. He had the car. But instead of being by her side, Harold was at the golf course, completely unreachable and indifferent. Eventually, Dorothy went without him and gave birth to their daughter, Harolyn. And while the child was a blessing, it quickly became clear that a baby wouldn't fix a broken marriage. Dorothy's struggles didn't end at home. As a black woman in 1940s Hollywood, she was constantly pushed aside, offered demeaning maid roles, and denied the kind of opportunities she knew she deserved. But Dorothy wasn't one to settle. She refused to play stereotypes, and her persistence finally paid off when she landed the role of Melmendi, Queen of the Ashuba, in Tarzan's Peril. It was a breakthrough, but it didn't come without backlash. Her costumes drew fire from censors, who accused the film of being too provocative. The controversy put both the movie and her career at risk. Dorothy Dandridge was suddenly everywhere, but not for the reasons you'd expect. The controversy surrounding her revealing outfits in Tarzan's Peril generated so much buzz that it catapulted her into the spotlight. Ironically, it was all the chatter about what she was not wearing that helped make her a household name. The attention landed her on the cover of Ebony magazine, a milestone for any black actress at the time. On the surface, it looked like Dorothy had finally arrived. Her dreams were coming true. But behind that glamorous smile was a woman holding herself together through heartbreak. By the time her Ebony cover hit stands, Dorothy was privately reeling. Her marriage to Harold Nicholas had completely crumbled. Years of infidelity and emotional neglect had taken their toll, and Harold had finally walked out, leaving her to raise their daughter alone. Dorothy filed for divorce, which was finalized in 1951. But rather than let it break her, she used it as a turning point. Now, free from the control of her husband, her mother, and her mother's partner, Dorothy stepped into the world as her own woman. She could have easily been manipulated by the many predatory men of Hollywood, but she made a smart move. She teamed up with pianist and vocal coach Phil Moore, who helped her transform her image. Together, they crafted a sultry, sophisticated nightclub act that was designed to turn heads. And it worked. In May 1951, Dorothy debuted her new act at the famed Mocambo nightclub, the epicenter of Hollywood nightlife. Her performance turned heads, stirred conversations, and opened doors. She was electric. From that moment on, bookings poured in, from New York to Paris. She was dazzling audiences around the world. But even with the spotlight shining brighter than ever, not every stage was as glamorous as it looked. When Dorothy Dandridge stepped onto the nightclub stage, she sparkled, literally and figuratively. Dressed in glittering gowns and armed with a voice that could melt hearts, she captivated every room she entered. But when the curtain fell and the applause faded, she returned to a far less glamorous reality. One laced with racism, humiliation, and heartbreak. Despite being the star attraction, Dorothy often performed in segregated venues where she wasn't even allowed to walk through the hotel lobby. She couldn't use the elevator, the public restrooms, or even address the audience directly. While white performers enjoyed luxurious dressing rooms, Dorothy was given a storage closet. That cruel duality, being adored on stage but degraded behind it, slowly wore her down. Her name lit up marquees, and her face graced magazine covers. But the emotional toll of performing for people who wouldn't have sat beside her at dinner was crushing. Like too many artists before her, Dorothy sought solace in alcohol and prescription pills. She managed to keep it together, for a while. In the midst of it all, love briefly offered her an escape. One night in Vegas, Peter Lawford, charming, witty, and British, came to see her perform. She was drawn to him instantly, and the two began a quiet but intense romance. Lawford, a member of the Rat Pack and brother-in-law to JFK, was smitten. But the times were cruel, and interracial relationships in Hollywood were still taboo. As their connection deepened, reality caught up with them. They confided in close friends like Gary Cooper, but they both knew that going public could destroy their careers. They had the kind of love that could have changed everything. But it came too soon, in a world not ready. Quietly, painfully, they let each other go. Still, for Dorothy, the heartbreak lingered. Some loves, after all, never really leave. Even though Dorothy Dandridge first met Peter Lawford in Las Vegas, she loathed the city. Sure, the money was good, but the atmosphere was rotten, especially the men. Still, a paycheck was a paycheck, and every gig came with the possibility of rubbing shoulders with Hollywood's elite. So when someone from the studio invited her to a post-show party hosted by Columbia Pictures boss Harry Cohn, she didn't hesitate. But what she walked into was no party. Instead of a lively crowd, Dorothy found herself alone in a hotel room with Cohn, a man whose reputation for predatory behavior was as infamous as his power in the industry. He launched into a pitch about how he could elevate her career. Dorothy knew the game. She also knew what he expected. She didn't play it. She stood up, walked out, and risked everything. Fortunately, not all her encounters in Vegas were so dark. After another show, she met actress Marie Wilson, a platinum blonde with a big heart. The two hit it off instantly, and within minutes, Wilson was dragging a Life magazine editor backstage to meet Dorothy. That introduction led to a stunning photo spread, one that turned heads and got Dandridge the kind of attention she'd always wanted, the right kind. Around that time, her press agent had another idea, one not about publicity, but romance. She had two incredibly beautiful clients, Dorothy Dandridge and singer-actor Harry Belafonte. Naturally, she set them up. The chemistry was electric, but there was a catch. Belafonte was still married. That didn't stop them from beginning a quiet affair, and at first, it was smooth sailing. They bonded over a mutual obsession with psychoanalysis, though eventually that became part of the problem. Their arguments started sounding like therapy sessions, filled with terms like boundaries, attachment, and castration complex. The romance fizzled out, but professionally they were just getting started. In 1953, Dorothy Dandridge finally landed the kind of role she'd dreamed of her whole life, a leading part in MGM's Bright Road. This wasn't the usual stereotypical mammy or hypersexualized role Hollywood had pushed on black actresses for decades. Dorothy would play a dedicated schoolteacher trying to connect with a troubled boy. Even better? The school principal was played by none other than Harry Belafonte. It marked the beginning of a powerful on-screen partnership, and the best was yet to come. At the same time, acclaimed director Otto Preminger was gearing up to adapt the opera Carmen into a major motion picture. He was in a rebellious phase, having just clashed with Hollywood's censors, and was determined to challenge the system even more. Preminger believed there were countless black actors being overlooked, and he wanted to change that. That made him exactly the kind of filmmaker who could launch Dorothy Dandridge into superstardom. But first, she had to convince him she was right for the role. Preminger had doubts. After seeing her in the modest schoolmarm role in Bright Road, he wasn't sure she could embody Carmen's seductive, fiery spirit. Dorothy took that as a challenge. In a now legendary moment, she let down her hair, smudged her eyeliner, and lowered her neckline before striding into his office and commanding the room. It worked. The role of Carmen was the most daring and desirable lead Hollywood had ever offered a black actress. Dorothy was ecstatic, and so was Preminger, who proudly announced the casting. But behind her excitement was a wave of anxiety. For the first time in her career, Dorothy hesitated. The expectations were enormous, and she feared she wouldn't live up to them. In a moment of panic, Dorothy's agent called Preminger to say she was backing out. Preminger didn't wait. He showed up at her apartment in person. He reassured her, insisted she was the only one for the role, and begged her not to quit. He didn't just talk her off the ledge. That night, their professional relationship turned personal, and it was far from a fling. It was the beginning of a passionate, complicated romance that would define and haunt much of the next chapter in Dorothy Dandridge's life. Dorothy Dandridge and Otto Preminger's romance didn't fizzle once Carmen Jones wrapped. It burned on throughout the film's release and beyond. The catch? Preminger was still very much married, yet the two made little effort to keep their relationship secret. Surprisingly, the behind-the-scenes affair didn't derail the film or its promotion. If anything, Carmen Jones was a smash, and at the center of all the buzz was one name: Dorothy Dandridge. The film didn't just succeed, it made history. Dandridge became the first black woman to appear on the cover of Life magazine. Off that momentum, she landed a major studio deal, 3 films at $75,000 each. But nothing topped what came next. Dorothy Dandridge became the first black actor ever nominated for Best Actress at the Academy Awards. It was a groundbreaking moment. At the 27th Oscars, she faced a legendary lineup: Jane Wyman, Judy Garland, Audrey Hepburn, and Grace Kelly. Though the statue ultimately went to Kelly, Dandridge's electric performance lived on, cementing her as a force in Hollywood. From the outside, it looked like Dorothy had finally arrived, but privately, cracks were forming. Behind his charming facade, Preminger was known in the industry as Otto the Ogre. His tantrums on set were infamous, but what was even more troubling was how that domineering personality spilled into their relationship. Dandridge, once again, found herself entangled with a man whose love came with control, volatility, and emotional whiplash. Meanwhile, she suffered another devastating loss, this time closer to home. Dorothy had always been close to her sister Vivian. The two were inseparable, and Dorothy even brought Vivian as her date to the Oscars. But a year later, Vivian abruptly vanished from her life. She stopped answering calls, distanced herself from everyone, and moved away. Distraught, Dorothy eventually hired a private detective to find her. They did find her, working in the south of France, living in New York, but no one could explain the sudden disappearance. The emotional toll of the mystery weighed heavily on Dorothy. Her relationship with her sister deteriorated, and so did other parts of her once glamorous life. The heartbreak was no longer just on screen. After Carmen Jones made Dorothy Dandridge a star, it made sense that she turned to Otto Preminger again when planning her next move. After all, he'd helped her break barriers. Why wouldn't he help her do it again? But this time, trusting him would be a mistake that cost her dearly. Preminger, like Dorothy, had uncompromising standards, but his expectations may have been unrealistic. Whenever the studio offered Dorothy a role, Otto would tell her to wait for something better. At first, it seemed like good advice, but when 2 high-profile films came her way, including one where she'd play a slave, Preminger was adamant: no supporting parts, and certainly nothing he considered demeaning. He wanted only lead roles for her. But Hollywood wasn't ready for that kind of thinking, especially for a black actress. Before long, studios began to label Dorothy as difficult, and the roles stopped coming. Their personal relationship wasn't faring any better. In 1955, Dorothy found out she was pregnant with Preminger's child. But instead of celebration, she was met with pressure. Both Otto and the studio insisted she end the pregnancy, fearing scandal. She complied, but it left her emotionally shattered and fully aware that Otto had no intention of leaving his wife. As with her earlier romance with Peter Lawford, Dorothy once again found herself constrained by race, reputation, and respectability. Then came a public blow that shook her to the core. At the height of her fame, Confidential magazine ran a shocking story. What Dorothy Dandridge did in the woods. It detailed an alleged sexual encounter with a white bandleader back in 1950, an accusation clearly designed to scandalize and smear her name. Dorothy didn't stay silent. In 1957, she filed a libel suit against Confidential and their parent company. She later testified at a criminal trial, pointing out that segregation laws at the time would have made the alleged affair logistically impossible. She wasn't even allowed to leave her hotel, let alone sneak off into the woods. Her testimony helped prove the magazine's lies and changed how tabloids operated in Hollywood. It was a rare victory, but one that came at a heavy price. In 1957, Dorothy Dandridge made a long-awaited return to the screen with Island in the Sun, her first film in 3 years. It should have been a triumph, and in some ways, it was. The movie dared to touch on the taboo of interracial romance, a bold move for its time. But behind the scenes, the censors stripped away nearly every trace of intimacy, watering down what could have been a groundbreaking moment. Worse, Dandridge wasn't even the lead. It was a comeback, but not the one she truly deserved. Other offers trickled in, but none had the weight or prestige she was after. It wasn't until 2 years later that another major opportunity came along, Porgy and Bess. The film adaptation of the controversial opera was a hot property for Hollywood studios, but a cold one for black actors. Many, including Sidney Poitier, hesitated to take part in a story criticized for its negative depiction of black life. Poitier only agreed after Samuel Goldwyn offered him $75,000 and threatened legal action. For Dandridge, the timing simply lined up. She hadn't headlined a film since Carmen Jones, and despite her misgivings about the role, she accepted the part of Bess. At the time, she had just ended her toxic relationship with Otto Preminger and hoped the project would be a fresh start. But fate had other plans. When Goldwyn clashed with the original director, he brought in a familiar face to replace him, Preminger. Dorothy's relief turned into dread. Almost immediately, Preminger began criticizing her performance and insisting she needed coaching. Whatever emotional wounds had begun to heal were ripped wide open again, and the film itself seemed cursed. Costly delays, creative clashes, and a devastating fire that destroyed sets and costumes all pushed the production to the brink. By the time Porgy and Bess limped into theaters, it was too late. The film flopped, both critically and commercially. For Dandridge, it was another crushing blow. She took time off to perform live again, hoping to recenter herself and make ends meet. But that break from film would turn out to be permanent. The years of emotional abuse, professional disappointment, and relentless pressure had taken their toll. She became increasingly dependent on alcohol and prescription pills just to function. Her health began to decline, and her stage performances lost the spark they once had. Audiences noticed. Her popularity slipped, and the downward spiral began. Amid all this, she met Jack Dennison. At first, he seemed different, maybe even like the fairy tale ending she'd been waiting for after so many heartbreaks. But the reality was far darker. Dennison wasn't a savior. He was violent, manipulative, and had a shady past. As Dorothy struggled to hold herself together, Dennison was only dragging her down further. Her heartbreak over Preminger had left her emotionally hollow, and with Dennison now at her side, it seemed like he was intent on draining what little she had left. The woman who had once captivated the world was fading, and almost no one noticed until it was too late. By the end, Dorothy Dandridge had only one source of income left: nightclub performances. But even that was sabotaged by the man who claimed to love her. Jack Dennison, her abusive husband, pushed her to perform at his own restaurant. It was a far cry from the prestigious clubs where she once shined. The association with his low-tier venue damaged her reputation, and soon the offers stopped coming. She did have a fallback, an oil investment she hoped would secure her future. But in yet another cruel twist, it turned out to be a scam. She lost everything. Desperate to turn her life around, Dorothy sought medical help for her deepening depression. But her health was already unraveling, made worse by growing dependence on alcohol and pills. She also lived in fear of Dennison, and things reached a terrifying point. She attempted suicide not once, but 3 times. Her loved ones watched helplessly, but only Dorothy could pull herself back from the edge. In the early 1960s, she found the strength to leave Dennison. She filed for divorce and decided to restart her career. She returned to the stage, even to Las Vegas, a city she famously disliked, and began appearing on talk shows. A book deal was even in the works. Then, in 1963, she did something unthinkable for a Hollywood starlet. She told the truth. On the Mike Douglas show, Dandridge revealed the heartbreaking secret she had kept hidden for years. Her daughter, Carolyn, or Lynn, had been born with severe brain damage. Lynn couldn't speak or recognize her mother and required round-the-clock care. Dorothy had quietly paid for a private caregiver, but never discussed her daughter publicly. Until that moment. The most tragic part? Dorothy blamed herself. On the day Lynn was born, she delayed going to the hospital, waiting for her husband. The birth was difficult, and doctors had to use forceps, an act Dandridge believed had caused the damage. Whether true or not, the guilt haunted her for the rest of her life. As the money disappeared and her health worsened, friends suspected that this guilt, more than fame or failure, was what truly broke Dorothy Dandridge. Dorothy Dandridge had spent 2 decades tirelessly working, enduring humiliation, rejection, and heartbreak, just to give her daughter the care she needed. Every film, every performance, every paycheck was for Lynn. But when Dorothy's last financial hope, an oil investment, turned out to be a scam, she lost everything. She had to give up her home, and just when things couldn't seem to get any worse, the unimaginable happened. Lynn's caretaker arrived at her door, dropped the child off, and walked away. Dorothy was devastated. She didn't have the money, the health, or the resources to care for Lynn. In a painful, heartbreaking decision, she was forced to place her daughter in a state mental institution. The guilt consumed her. Still, she clung to hope. If she could rebuild her career, maybe she could bring Lynn back. She booked a tour, began rehearsals, and saw a path forward. But that hope was short-lived. A foot injury forced her to cancel her shows. Just like after Carmen Jones, the momentum vanished. Defeated, she returned to the same dark coping mechanisms, pills and alcohol. Yet she pushed forward. There was one last opportunity, an important gig in New York. Dorothy told herself she would make it, but she never did. The night before her planned departure, she made a strange, eerie phone call to a friend. Without explanation, she softly sang Barbra Streisand's People in its entirety. And just before hanging up, she whispered something haunting. "Whatever happens, I know you will understand." Worried but unsure what to make of it, her friend went to bed uneasy. The next morning, the fear became real. Dorothy's manager, Earl Mills, entered her Los Angeles apartment and found her lifeless body, nude, cold, and unresponsive. Dorothy Dandridge was dead. She was only 42. Her sudden passing sent shockwaves through the entertainment world. Everyone wanted answers, but the truth was elusive. Conflicting reports muddied the story. One pathology institute claimed it was an overdose of the antidepressant imipramine, while the official coroner pointed to a fat embolism caused by her foot injury. Even in death, Dorothy remained an enigma. But to those closest to her, the mystery had a darker explanation. Quietly, some of her friends began to whisper a chilling theory that her abusive ex-husband, Jack Dennison, may have had a hand in her death. Dorothy Dandridge's funeral was a quiet affair, modest in size but filled with those who had truly loved her. Among the mourners was Peter Lawford, the man many believed was the love of her life. Though they had drifted apart and he'd even married someone else in the years since their relationship, his presence spoke volumes. Lawford wasn't just there. He was one of the pallbearers and had been asked to deliver a eulogy. But when the moment came, he couldn't do it. Overcome with emotion, Lawford stood silent, visibly shaken by the loss. His reaction made it heartbreakingly clear that his feelings for Dorothy had never really faded. And he wasn't the only one left devastated. Dorothy's sister Vivian, who had once been her closest companion, didn't attend. After their falling out years earlier, when Vivian vanished without explanation, the sisters had never fully reconciled. Dorothy continued to quietly send money to Vivian and her son, but at the time of her death, they still hadn't spoken. Vivian was so heartbroken by the news that she couldn't bring herself to go to the funeral. Afterward, she disappeared from public life entirely. Dorothy Dandridge spent her final years in a modest 3-bedroom apartment at 8495 Fountain Avenue in West Hollywood, California. Far from the glamour of her Hollywood stardom, the apartment reflected the quiet, tragic descent of a woman who had once been hailed as the Black Marilyn Monroe. The space was unremarkable, humble furnishings, small rooms, and little to suggest it had once belonged to the first black woman nominated for a Best Actress Oscar. The building itself, a mid-century complex near the Sunset Strip, still stands today. While many apartments in the area have been renovated or modernized, Dandridge's former unit retains a haunting simplicity. Locals pass by without realizing the deep history held within those walls. There are no plaques, no signs, just shadows of what once was. A few devoted fans occasionally stop to snap a photo, aware of the tragic legacy hidden behind the brick facade. Despite being forgotten by the city she helped break barriers in, the apartment remains a quiet monument to a star who burned bright and faded far too soon. Dorothy Dandridge died in 1965, largely unrecognized by the industry she had helped transform. It wasn't until decades later, in the 1980s and beyond, that Hollywood began to truly honor her legacy. Pioneering artists like Halle Berry, Angela Bassett, Janet Jackson, and Whitney Houston have all acknowledged Dandridge as a trailblazer, someone who made it possible for black women to be seen, heard, and celebrated in American cinema. And that's the wrap-up for this video. Thanks for watching. As always, if you enjoyed this content, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. I'll see you next time. Bye for now.